Zach, they put Powerbalance in red, so obviously I was expecting Magus the Sensei's top in red and didn't get it. I would have played red, man. I would have turn 1 Volked a bunch.
Yep, I could see that. I could see you casting Volcanic Island.
Yeah, I would have cast so many Volks. So many Volks. I would have been a Volk. People know me as a Tundra bro. No. I'd be a Volk boy.
Yeah, Volk bro. Volk boy. So let's start with Amped Raptor, which is an uncommon. It is a 2/1 first strike creature for 2 mana. That's 1 in a red. When Amped Raptor enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy. Then, if you cast it from your hand, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. Then you may cast that card by paying any amount of energy equal to its mana cost rather than paying its mana cost. This is a card that, like, I feel like some people have been like, maybe this is a card? Like, is this like a weird, like, maybe I would play this as like a like, try and get there early in, like, Rhinos or something? I don't know.
So the first thing, when everybody was going crazy for this card, but the first thing that I saw of this card, I'm looking it up right now. It's a creature, and when it first came out, it was like a standard all-star, and it was 1 in a red for it was either a 1/1 or a 2/1, but then it had prowess, and when it ETB'd, you exiled the top card of your deck.
Abbot of Carekeep.
Abbot of Carekeep. So my first thought was like, this is pretty close to Abbot of Carekeep, except, you know, you can't pick up a land off of it, but, you know, you get the free spell when you cast it, and
you won't hit a land either, which is the thing.
Right, yeah. Like, you'll get action. So it's like, okay, well, how good would it be if Abbot of Carekeep just ETB'd and then flipped over and drew you action? And then what does that action look like? And it's a one-shot action, so, like, how good is that? And I go, well, if it's one-shot action, then it's probably not strong enough, right? Because if you're playing a 1-red 2/1, even if it's got first strike, okay, you're playing a 1-red 2/1, and if you flip over your Ponder, it's like, okay, it's a 2/1 that pondered, and that's pretty good, but is it worthwhile given that there's going to be some amount of variance? And, you know, there's other shenanigans where it's like you can clear the top cards of your library if you have like excess shape on top that you want to clear out of the way. Like, okay, there's little implications here and there. But I haven't been super enamored by this card outside of people who are just like trying to go glass cannon.
Yeah.
Like, you play one of these and one Thassa's Oracle, and then you mulligan till both of them are in your hand, and then you just put the Thassa's Oracle on the bottom, and then you just win the game when you cast the Raptor. And, okay, cool, glass cannon, and it sucks. But I haven't been told or thought of any ways that this card is actually as hot and awesome as everybody has presented it to be, or has seemed that it's been. But
the only thing I can see this is like being really like
going down the weeds.
Like a reason to play this card would be like if you want to be the 1-mana lightning bolt deck, and that's just not viable in this format. Like and like there are things like Skewer the Critics and cards like that like are just, you know, like better includes. So like getting a 2/1 that like literally dies to Orcish Bowmasters, right? And then like also getting to have a lightning bolt attached to it just doesn't excite me.
Yeah, there's other spots where I was like, okay, well, you theoretically could spend a bunch of cards to generate some energy because there are some good cheap energy producers. And then maybe if you cast this early on, instead of saying that you're going to flip a 2-drop, maybe you can flip something higher. So if you go Galvanic Discharge on 1, get some energy, or tune the narrative, get 2 energy, and then play this, it's like, okay, well, now you could flip something thicker and cast it for free. Yeah. And maybe in that space, there's something, you know, appealing. It's like, okay, you're casting this with, you know, excess energy, and you're flipping over fucking Ad Nauseam or something. I don't know. Like, whatever the, like, insane payoff is that's better than whatever is available for 2 mana. Because I could also see a world, like, the energy stompy world of, like, all right, I'm going to play this, then I'm going to flip over Minsc and Boo, and I'm going to make Phil hate himself. You know, like, it's like, all right, maybe there's something like that, but
yeah.
It just seems like it seems like it's an additional loop for not guaranteed action. Like, this is in your deck, and you don't have a clear point of view of what it's actually going to do, unless you're making like those really, really thick glass cannon concessions the way that like Cascade does.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, I can only play with this subset of cards, that way I can just guarantee that I know what my cards do. And unless you're doing something like that with this, then I don't know. I mean, I guess in a way that this is sort of a cascade type card because you get 2 energy and then you flip over a 0-drop and then theoretically cast the 0-drop for no energy and make a bunch of rhinos. So like maybe there's that. Like maybe there's like now Cascade has between the Delirium Cascader and this, because this is functionally Cascade for energy, right? Like,
yeah.
It's like maybe there's that space, but is that enough? Is that cool? Is that powerful enough? I'm not sure.
I have a problem with any of this, like, flip the card off the top of your deck strategies, especially, like, unless you're playing, like, exactly like a Cascade deck, like a Rhino-style deck that, like, you know, or, like, Living End or something, where, like, the whole deck is built around this. Like, to get to the point where you want to be doing what this card wants you to do, you need to get energy somehow, which means you have to have cards that cost less than this card so that you can get energy, so that by the time you cast it, you're going to have energy to spend to get to do your Cascade thing. So I just don't. I think this card's too fair. You know.
Yeah.
I think it's just not getting all the way in.
The problem is that it's not quite Cascade in the same way where it's like, okay, if you played exactly 1 amped Raptor, or I'm sorry, it's not looking at CMCs. It's just looking at your next spell. And that's what makes it so much more difficult to like wrap your head around, because the difference between non-land spells and spells is just so much wider that it's like, how do you actually calibrate your deck in a way that you're not just spinning the wheel for value? And I don't know if like a spinning the wheel for value is good enough, given that I don't know what the value would even be. That's enough to warrant the fact that this is taking up a slot in your deck.
Yeah. Yeah. And it has to be cast from hand, so you can't like chain into like two or three of these. Like, that's the other thing. They fixed this card before they put it out, in my opinion.
Yeah. Right, if it was just cast this and then flip over every other copy of it and then flip over a 5th thing, like, that would be great. Yeah. Oh, you're saying 10 power for 5 toughness spread across 5 bodies plus an additional spell would be good for 2 mana? Is that what you're saying?
I think that would be that would be playable in this format, barely. It would just get there. Like, I mean, dude, Priest of Gix exists, right? Like, all right. Eternal Durdles is sponsored by Tales of Adventure. You can go to toamagic.com, use the code Durdles for 5% off your order, and you're going to get that whole order in one package. No more waiting for 5 or 6 or 12 packages to show up at your door so that you can finish your deck. toamagic.com, code Durdles for 5% off, and you'll be directly supporting the show. So let's move on to Flare of Disruption. This is the red flare. For 3 mana, it's instant that you can sacrifice a non-token red creature to pay instead of its cost. It says, copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Phil, this one, I think, well, it's going to see play in CEDH for sure. Like, whatever. Not that we're a CDH podcast, but this is the kind of card that, like, you want for your Sakashima Krark deck. Get the Krarkulator out.
Get the Krarkulator out. Yeah, I feel as though the bottleneck on this card again is going to be like, what's the red creature that you're trying to sack?
Well, I can answer that for you. The red creature you're trying to sack is 100% Goblin Guide. After you've attacked with it, you've cast Fire Blast. So you're just like turning this into Fire Blasts 5 through 8.
So you're just looking at this as
now,
just a 0 mana burn spell.
I don't necessarily know if that's where you want to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not where I want to be. A 0, like I'm not sleeving up Lava Spike ever. But if you ever see me put a Goblin Guide on the table, you need to have an intervention with me immediately. But I mean, I guess the most powerful aspect of this card is like, if it's just a 0 mana burn spell for burn, I guess that's not too far off the beaten path of like where it's going to be like the most powerful, because 0 mana is really powerful and they already have a bunch of 0 mana spells in that deck anyway, like you said with Powerbalance. So yeah, maybe if it's like, this just represents an additional copy of whatever you have for 0 mana, as long as you have enough creatures. But then I have to assume that you have the density of creatures to do that. So if you're in burn, you're what, Goblin Guide, Swift Spear, and Eidolon?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I guess 12 copies is enough. I mean, I also think that like it's possible that maybe these flares aren't 4-ofs. It's possible that.
I would not play 4 of this card. This would be if I'm not saying I play Burn ever, because I don't. Like Eric, shout out to Eric Higby who plays Burn. Like that's the only deck he ever plays. But I think that like as it maybe a 2 of or something in the deck as like like this is a gotcha card for sure. If you want to be more like balls to the wall like Burn deck, this might give you that speed you need to be competitive. In at a LGS, it's certainly not going to like hit top tables. The other thing, Phil, though, that is important to note about this card is it does not copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. So you could copy something your opponent does.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how interesting it is because similarly, let's say one of the really bad matchups for Burn has been combo, and but the thing is that like it wouldn't necessarily protect against opposing Storm because if you copy their tendrils, you wouldn't get a trigger. You wouldn't get a Storm trigger because that's a cast trigger. So I am not sure if it actually would solve any additional problems, but it does bring the additional heat that I wasn't thinking of. Again, I'm not happy that there's potentially a boost to Burn before I get Magus of the Sensei's top. But yeah, there is the interesting situation where it's like, all right, you have a creature and they have a creature and they point a removal spell at your creature, you sack in response and then copy and kill their creature. And so you, instead of being down that exchange, you go even on that exchange but clear the board. Like maybe that's not the worst. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the idea of like the creatures in Burn having a lifespan of desirability is pretty dead late game. You're just happy to have them early. That converting any amount of damage
and blocked by Triumph of St. Catherine, they're not very useful.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it through the lens of like, okay, Fire Blast is sacks your mountains and Flare is Fire Blast, but you sack a creature. It's like, okay, I think that's the most compelling thought anyone has presented to me so far with the Flare. So that's an interesting space. I mean, it seems like pretty sold that like somewhere this card has to show up. Like it's a powerful enough effect. Yeah, that you'd be like this is a powerful enough effect for 0 mana that you'd be like, okay, this is reasonable. But like having to figure out where you can do it proactively or in a way that like is actually not contingent on your opponent agreeing to do what you want them to. Burn seems like the cool place. That's a good call.
Yeah, and then there's also things like just looking at this card and trying to figure out like, are there other combo cards that like, like what if you duplicated Scape Shift, right? Like obviously we're not casting Scape Shift in Legacy, but I'm just like thinking about like if you could put a red creature into that deck, like I'm just thinking like, are there cards that we already have strategies for that are good that if we duplicated those spells, the game would just be over? Like Scape Shift is obviously a bad example because generally if you cast Scape Shift, the game is over. But just trying to think if there's anything like that, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. It's just space that I should explore mentally when evaluating.
I can't think of it only because I don't know if there's that type of deck that also just like clearly features a red creature. Like I know some people were talking about this in Ruby Storm, and you have like Bergie or something like. But it's like if you're doing that, you're probably going off already. Like you're not trying to get those creatures off the board. That's why your discussion about Burn was the most interesting because it's like, the effectiveness of those creatures is like limited to a narrow window, as opposed to the other combo decks where it's like if they're doing something like Bergie, they're probably trying to kill you with Bergie on the table. They don't have any interest in having that not be there. Where it's like, sorry, your Goblin Guide's lifespan, it did 4 damage, and then now there's just a brick wall in the way. So good luck. It's like, all right, well, I would love to sack that Goblin Guide and copy any burn spell and just get some value out of it.
That's why I don't work in Quark Shakashima deck because you'll have like 12 Quarks on the board.
Yeah. In which case, just copying 40 things.
You just sacrifice one of your 17 Quarks.
Yeah, I mean, any combo deck in CEDH is just going to put a Rogok onto the table and just have a free copy whenever they want.
Oh, yeah, as well, yeah. All right. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel. Frogmyr Enforcer is a 7-mana artifact creature that is a 4/4 Frogmyr with affinity for artifacts, but it also has prototype, so that you could create a 2/2 for 4 mana. Still has affinity for artifacts. Phil, I have a question about this, and maybe you can answer this for me. So, we were talking about Kozilek's Unsealing. If I prototype this, do I get to draw for Kozilek's Unsealing? You don't. Okay. I was just like, I'm building a deck right now with all the 7 mana, affinity cards. Because there's 3 of them. There's this, there's Myr Enforcer, and there's Sojourner's, or Sojourner's Conjure or something? Construct. There's 12 of those effects. I'm looking at this deck in a way you could just burn through the whole deck and then be like, well, I have a couple of, mana rocks in terms of Opal and Lotus Petal. I guess I'll just cast Thassa's Oracle. I drew my whole deck.
Yeah. My understanding for prototype is that if you do something for its prototype cost, it just has the characteristics of whatever the box of prototype is.
Got it.
So if you cast this for 1 red off of affinity, then it would be 3 and a red on the table.
I see.
That box is what it's identified with, if that's what it was put in to play with. Yeah. The
main reason I even bring this card up is because of Kozilek's Unsealing. Also, the closer we get towards there are already decks playing Frogmyr and stuff like that. So I don't know that 7 mana is exactly where you want to be. 12 7 mana guys in your affinity deck, or your 8 cast style deck. But this is another tool in that slot, and because you have access to prototype, you can at least get it onto the board if you're in that situation. So this card is maybe a role player in a deck that doesn't yet exist, and that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, and if it exists, it won't be in my hands.
Yeah. All right. Ghostfire Slice is a 3 mana instant that's 2 and a red. For a devoid spell, it says this spell costs 2 less to cast if an opponent controls a multicolored permanent, and then it deals 4 damage to any target.
Yeah, so the cost reduction of it being, just a souped up bolt if your opponent has a multicolored permanent, I'm always so wary about cards that are conditional on your opponent having presence. Because if it is, then 3 mana for 4 damage anywhere is not playable. So the idea that this would be contingent on them having a multicolored permanent, first, what multicolored permanents even see play currently? It's maybe you see Teferi every once in a while. But even if you did, you wouldn't be able to cast it at instant speed with the Teferi on the table.
Well, let's think about those permanents, Phil. Psychic Frog is probably going to see play, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe Baleful Strix exists in some realm. But Knight of the Reliquary is a card that, again, you're not guaranteed to see any of these cards. But I'm just thinking off the top of my head, the cards that you're going to see. Teferi, obviously.
Yeah, the problem with those first two, yes, Psychic Frog will see play. Knight of the Reliquary obviously sees play. But both of those creatures are also theoretically not killed by this spell.
Yeah.
Your Knight could just come in as a 5/5 and it's nice 4 damage spell. Or unless you're specifically looking to go face. But if you're looking to go face, you would be more interested in the efficient stuff that's guaranteed to convert the damage that you need. And then Psychic Frog, it's okay, well, if my opponent unloads this thing and you just discard a couple of cards, and granted, it may not be useful for them to discard cards, they might let it go. But the thing is that they get to decide that if they have the resources to play with, right? They can choose to keep a really thick beater on the table that's going to recoup them those cards. So I think the context of what deck would even want this? What home would it exist in? And then is there enough problems that this would have to solve? And I think the answer is just no. I mean, maybe in Modern it's a little bit there's more multicolored permanents that I'm not thinking of. But in Legacy, it's Minsk has been pushed out because Up the Beanstalk doesn't work with it. Teferi still sees play, but it doesn't work against Teferi because Teferi pluses to 5 and you wouldn't be able to instant speed in response anyway. Psychic Frog will see play but can get out of range. Knight of the Reliquary, if they're aware of Ghostfire Slice, are just okay, I'll just not let you kill it.
Yeah.
So
I think the important thing here for this card, besides everything that you just pointed out, is the fact that it says any target, so it can go to face.
It can go face.
So that if you're looking at a Psychic Frog and your opponent has a card in his hand and it's a 3/3, don't aim it at this, or 2 cards to say, don't aim it at this. But again, this is a card that I think like maybe Burn gets a step up with this card out of the sideboard or something. I only bring it up because like of that. Back in the day, this is a playoff of a card called Ghost Flame. Ghost Flame was a colorless red burn spell that I think it cost 3 mana for a 3 damage burn spell. And that was a big deal when it came out because creatures had protection from red. Circle of Protection red exists. You know, like there was a card, I think, called Ghostly Flame, different than Ghost Flame, from Ice Age, that was a red and black permanent that just said, all of your spells are colorless now. So that could get around, like, you know.
Yeah, man. You're reminding me, like, Kozilek's Return saw its day in the sun a while back as a sideboard slot because it was an instant
Couldn't blue blast
it. Well, you couldn't blue blast it, but also your Mother of Runes couldn't interact with it.
Yep.
So it was a tool to get rid of Mother of Runes if you weren't playing sweepers otherwise that they couldn't protect their team with. So, like, yeah, you know, if like that ever became a problem where you're like, yes, I need to get around that sort of effect, and Devoid does that, even if I'm paying 3 for it, at least, you know, I'm not having to go down cards or like this thing that's otherwise shutting me down. But it just seems like it's not priced to move.
Yeah. Keep in mind also, all of the flip planeswalkers, once they flip, are multicolored.
True.
All right. Moving on to Party Thrasher. Party Thrasher is a 2-mana 1/4 non-creature spells you cast from exile have Convoke. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, this is a Lizard Wizard as a 1/4. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may discard a card. If you do, exile the top 2 cards from your library, then choose one of them, and you may play that card this turn.
Yeah, so it is interesting that there is the clause that you have to choose at the time of the thing. You can't like progress through your turn and eventually just cast one. They make you choose immediately.
Yeah.
So like you have to like, this is one of those cards where I imagine you have to think through like what the turn actually looks like and then make your choice. So like the pause will be on that because you can't like cantrip again to see what else you got to make a choice. You just got to choose. So I guess that's an interesting qualm. I don't think this is priced to move. I don't think this is it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair... Like, they couldn't make this cost 1 for sure. It would be very playable then. I think this... If this sees any play at all, again, like, it's red. We're probably talking about burn decks that are sick of drawing lands and are like, I'll play this, and now I have a choice of 2 cards. Is burn gonna be playable in this format in a way that, like, makes me think that I won't just see it at my LGS occasionally? No. But
yeah,
it is worth including, worth mentioning, because this does filter your hand when you're looking for more gas. So
it is.
You know,
it is to be fair for that aspect. It is a one-sided Howling Mine. You know, like you do, but it's. But the thing is at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase. So if you cast this, you don't actually see the effect until the following turn. And man, do cards that ask you to get through a turn cycle feel impossible?
Yeah. I mean, hey, you could just tap all your creatures and cast something from your hand to get that value.
You can't. It's from exile.
No, I'm saying from exile. Never mind. Well, what if you have a Rift Bolt in exile?
Yeah, you just can't wait for that Rift Bolt to come off. You have to spend 3 creatures to cast it.
Yep. All right. Phil, you've been waiting for this. Powerbalance is a 2 red mana enchantment that says, whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, you may cast that spell without paying its mana cost if the 2 spells had the same mana value. Cook, bro.
First off, let's talk about how sweet this artwork is. Did I lose you? Am I gone? Did I lose you?
You're back.
Did I get so hyped that our connection broke?
It seemed like it, yes.
First off, that art is exquisite. What beautiful artwork. Now, all of the talk that I've had about Powerbalance is that everybody is like paying homage to it in the same way. Obviously, it was inspired by Counterbalance. And so everybody's been looking at it through the same lens as Counterbalance. And fam, even though it may be enabled by the same thing that Counterbalance is enabled at, they are so starkly different. One is like Counterbalance is disruption. Counterbalance is a way that's stopping your opponent from doing things. Power Balance ain't stopping your opponents from doing shit. Power Balance is a mana cheat. It's a mana cheat. You have to look at it as a way that you're cheating on mana. Counterbalance ain't cheating on mana. Counterbalance is disruption. So, like, everybody was like, yeah, I'm going to put Power Balance and Counterbalance in the same deck. And I'm like, okay, your deck is going to be extremely unfocused and not know what to do. Because they're two...
You're going to have, like, 3 Power Balances and 3 Counterbalances in play at one point.
Now, here's the thing. It's like, now you could play them both, but both are 2-mana do-nothings that require your opponent to act. And if you're not exactly set up to protect against that type of thing, and partially the reason why I find Counterbalance to be effective is because the shell, the ABC shell that it is part of, is the rest of the shell is about keeping the board clear, right? Like, it is paired with Terminus, and then the enablers are such that the Terminus keeps the board clear, so Counterbalance can keep the stack clear.
Yeah.
Power Balance doesn't have that same thing, and red is extremely cost prohibitive. Like, that ain't an easy mana cost. But so like the way that I envision Power Balance working is like, okay, let's say that you're in a deck that like has similar enablers. I don't envision any Power Balance ever being able to exist without Mystic Sanctuary in a meaningful way, because you need the means to put. Now, granted, or when I say Mystic Sanctuary, I mean any of those lands that put stuff back on top of your library at instant speed, because this lets you cast any spell. It's not just instants or sorceries. You can cast anything off the top. So, but the aspects that you can think about that are really powerful here is like, if I have a Counterbalance on the table and we get into a counter war, if I have a fetch with a Lorium revealed in my graveyard, I know that that fetch represents a 0-mana way to counter a Force of Will. If I have Power Balance on the table and we're in that same position, I know that this fetch, if they try and counter my spell and we get into a resource exchange, this fetch now represents an Ancestral Recall for 0 mana. Now, that's really powerful, right? But the thing is that they are powerful in two diametrically opposed axes, right? Because if I lose that counter war over whatever that is, okay, cool, I may have the opportunity to reload, but it's different than if I win the counter war.
Yeah.
Right? Like the gameplay, the pattern that we're in is so vastly different. So whether or not Power Balance is good enough, the thing that I urge everybody who's looking at it is please get out of the lens of trying to compare it to Counterbalance. It is inspired by Counterbalance, but the ways that they're used are going to be so functionally and wildly different. And I would present myself as somebody who may have cast more Counterbalances than anyone else in the world at this point. Like, I may be the premier Counterbalance player on the planet, and I can tell you that these things will not function the same way. They are enabled the same way, but they will do wildly different things. Now, if this thing, the difference though is this can go up on mana, right? Because you can cheat on mana. And you could put a counterspell on top to then cast that counterspell for free, right? So in that same vein, you could theoretically put your own force. You could like let the Force of Will in that exchange resolve. That Force of Will falls off. Mystic Sanctuary, the Force of Will back to the top. And then if like you can fight again, you can have an exchange there. You know what I mean? Because they need to cast the spell and for the Power Balance to trigger. So you could, in response to the Power Balance trigger, do all the same type of counterbalance shenanigans. But the result is going to be different. The result is you not necessarily interacting, because you need that. The Power Balance itself isn't interacting the way Counterbalance does. Power Balance is letting whatever else you have interact, but it's giving you the mana to do so. So it's still a mana cheat, and it's potentially fixing your mana, both of which can be really appealing. But the ways in which you're going to build your deck, particularly because of the red prohibitive mana cost, are just so vastly different. So is this card going to be good enough to see a home? I think that's really contingent on if red is good enough. Now, one thing that I would be interested in to see is if the decks that have been playing Counterbalance out of the sideboard, you know, your Delver-ish decks that have been moving and playing Counterbalance out of the board, I wonder if those decks that are looking to play a longer game and grind a little bit harder, rather than trying to be disruptive to the opponent, since the deck actively wants to be aggressive and proactive anyway, if Power Balance is actually the more fruitful tool for them. Because I agree. If you go and cast something, and then in response I brainstorm with a Power Balance trigger on the stack, and then can cast a threat or cast a bolt or cast anything else in response to whatever you just did, that's now on the board, and then I can proceed to do other things. That seems more in line with what the Delver style decks would want to do. Now, obviously, you have to think about blue count. You have to think about the fact that maybe if they're not playing any basics, if they do play a basic, it's usually going to be the basic island. And there's a bunch of things coming into the format that might incentivize them to want to play the basic island, like that White Orchid Phantom that we talked about in the White review. So like there's going to be some push and pull of like what mana bases have to skew towards nowadays, following these additions. But I imagine that if Powerbalance sees play, it will probably see play in that Counterbalance slot as people test it out. But I imagine that it would do more for them than Counterbalance would, because Counterbalance against combo decks is arguably pretty slow. Like the way that combo functions these days, particularly because they have a lot of ways to get through it anyway. Like if you have a Counterbalance on the table and you're playing against combo and they just Veil of Summer and you don't have a 1 to beat the Veil of Summer, or if you do have a 1 on the table, but then they can just go off with a bunch of zeros, so it's like, it's not actually all that reliable in the counter matchup. Usually they'll bring in Counterbalance for the mirror. But if you're in the mirror, then you know that your CMCs are going to be still very similar, that Powerbalance might just be better because if anything, Powerbalance is your mana cheat. And so if you can get ahead on mana, now we're looking in the realm of like, okay, whoever breaks mana parity is going to be advantaged, which is, I get that it's weird to like calibrate Powerbalance closer to Deathrite Shaman than to Counterbalance, but that's, in my lens, that's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
It's a way that you can get ahead on mana in meaningful ways that you otherwise would like to be able to break parity. Like Powerbalance to me is a lot closer to like Carpet of Flowers.
Yeah, I agree.
Because that's functionally what it's doing. So will this see a home? The only place that I've seen it outside of like trying to build a new deck, which I'm obviously going to try and experiment with, but like outside of like the tier whatever fun stuff at FNM, like if this is going to see legitimate play at competitive tables, I imagine it's that board slot that you usually see for Grixis Delver or Blue-Red Delver or whatever that may look like. Because I could also see a world where if they don't, to get a reliable red-red, that you move away from Grixis, if that's powerful enough. But if you move away from Grixis, what tools does that open up in all of those slots? And if you have this proactive tool, this is not necessarily something that would be relegated to the sideboard as something that's at odds with you staying proactive. This is proactive. So if you're in a position where you're playing this game, this theoretically is a threat because your opponent now isn't going to look and be like, one thing that's really powerful about Counterbalance is that it changes the way your opponent has to behave. They have to start leading and baiting with spells to see the top of the library to see if it's going to resolve or not. And if they see a CMC, let's say they lead with a Ponder because they want to see if they can clear the way for their threat. If the Ponder gets countered, they just hold their 1-mana threat until the next turn so they can go again, right? Like it just changes the behavior pattern. But with Powerbalance, they know their shit's still going to resolve. So then they have to think about, okay, what is me casting something if it lines up with something that's on top of their deck? Now you have to think, okay, if I cast a 1-drop, how bad theoretically is any of the 1-drops that it might interact with be? Right? If I cast a 1-drop and there's a Ponder on top of your deck, how bad is that for me? If I cast a 1-drop and you have a DRC on top of your deck, how bad is that for me? Because you get it for free and you get it before my spell resolves.
And it's going to have quote-unquote haste on your turn.
Right. So the way that your opponent has to like respect the Powerbalance, the respect will be a different kind of respect because it's not will my spell resolve. It's what is I like it flips the paradigm, right?
Yeah.
Counterbalance, I'm thinking, what is it that I have to think about ahead of time that I want to stop? And I'm going to try and stack my deck to like make it so that the things that I need to ensure don't resolve. So I'm like, if I need to make sure that Bowmaster doesn't resolve, and I have a Ponder and can put a 2 on top, I'm just putting a 2 on top. Now you have to figure out whether or not you want to risk your Ponder. But if you cast Ponder and see that there's a 2 on top, or I mean, I wouldn't reveal it to you, but I'm going, when I stack my deck, I'm going, okay, I know that they'll be able to resolve their Ponders, their Brainstorms, their Bolts, their 1-mana threats, whatever. But I know for sure they're not going to be able to resolve Orcish Bowmaster because I have 2 on top. So I know that by the time I untap, I am protected from that CMC across the board. It's different with Powerbalance, right?
Yeah.
You got to be proactive. So I feel like I'm just reiterating myself now, but like if anybody is thinking about Powerbalance, you got to look at it in a different lens other than Counterbalance. It's not the same card. It's inspired, but it's so different.
Final note I want to make about this card too, Phil, is in a scenario where like you just fill your deck. There's 2 things. You can turn this into like a pseudo Counterbalance situation where if you can match up counter spells against same casting cost things, that'll do it. But that's really not what you're trying to. I feel like that's not what the value of this card is. Then my other thing is you have to think about timing. I talk about this a lot when I'm talking about Infect. You have to think about timing. And if your opponent casts a Delver of Secrets and you flip over a Lightning Bolt, it's got to go to his face. It can't hit the Delver Secrets. It hasn't been cast yet, right? So you have to think about how timing affects this card as well. And so I think, yeah, you have to be proactive with your counterbalance and not reactive.
Yeah, one thing to note on that front is the cast is a may. You may cast. You don't have to. But that's a good point that you bring up, because it is something that was on my mind that I don't know if I touched on yet. But the other side of the difference between power balance and counterbalance too is power balance actually can move through the deck in the way that counterbalance cannot. So if something does line up with power balance,
you need velocity.
cast the spell and then it's no longer on top of your deck. But the thing is too is that, like, if I play a counterbalance, I know that whatever's on top, it's locking them out for that turn. Where with power balance, if you cast something off the top, that the whole thing resets, right? Because now the top of the deck,
you're gonna get to see new cards.
So you're gonna get to see new cards, but it also means that, like, the layers of which you have to think of, like, how your spells are gonna line up, right? Because if they cast a 1-drop and you reveal a 1-drop and cast the 1-drop and the top of the deck is now blank again, like, if you had the means to be able to set up the top of your deck, like, if I pondered before you went, stacked the deck, and then you cast things, I have to now think of, like, what the full sequencing of that would look like in order to, like, try and leverage multiple spells per turn.
Well, there is a balance to that too, because your opponent's not going to cast several 1-drops into a counterbalance if they know that the 1-drop is there. You might net 2 or 3 spells off of an opponent, through luck, obviously, but, like, there is a power balance.
That's what I'm saying. Like, the difference that power balance can itself clear the top of the library for itself to get to the next thing in a way that counterbalance cannot is also something that's really powerful, and that is totally unlike counterbalance. As somebody who's cast a lot of counterbalance, anybody else who's played a lot of counterbalance, the top of the deck isn't going to change unless you change it. But power balance can change it itself if it lines up. And that means that how you sequence your cantripping and how you sequence your setups, or card draw in between, like, and responding to your power balance trigger, like, that's a whole additional layer tacked on top of it.
All right, well, let's go into Wheel of Potential. Wheel of Potential is a 3-mana sorcery. It says you get 3 energy counters, and then you may pay X energy. Each player may exile their hand and then draw X cards. If X is 7 or more, you may play cards you own exiled this way until the end of your next turn. I only mentioned this card. Because there were so many other energy cards that are, like, on the edge of seeing play, right? Tune the Aether, Tune the Narrative. The prison card that we were talking about, Static Prison. You get to a point where, like, has there ever been a time where we thought, like, do we want Wheel of Fortune in this deck? It's just a metric we don't think about Legacy at all. And I just don't know if that's ever really a thing. And it's also a May effect, which is an issue, because you're not going to disrupt your opponent with a May effect. It's just not going to happen. If they want to keep those cards in their hand, they're going to keep them, right?
Yeah, I think this spell falls precisely in line with a couple of the other ones we talked about, where it's like, this is a Legacy, this is a diet version of something that we have full powered in Legacy.
Yeah.
And there isn't going to ever be a deck, at least I can't foresee one, that will ever want a wheel effect that doesn't also want LED. And
Agreed.
That means that, like, any deck that has LED is just going to play Echo, because that means that your wheel is 0, right? You have a 0-mana wheel. So in that regard, like, it's like the color isn't even a constraint, because if you're playing LED, you're probably playing Petal, and if you're playing all of these mana rocks, then you have access to whatever colors you need anyway. So, like, that's not a constraint. So I imagine that, like, Echo of Eons is just pricing this shit out.
Yeah. All right. Finally, we're going to talk about the Flip Planeswalker, Ral Monsoon Mage, for 1 and a red. He is a 1/3, and it says instants and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell during your turn, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, Ral deals 1 damage to you. If you win the flip, you may exile Ral. If you do, return him to the battlefield. Flipped is a Planeswalker that has a 2 loyalty and says, Ral Leyline Prodigy enters the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter on him for each instant and sorcery you've cast this turn. So in a world where you're storming out, you could get this guy pretty high, right? And it says at +1 until your next turn, instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast. -2, Ral deals 2 damage divided as you choose amongst 2 targets, 1 or 2 targets. draw a card if you control a blue permanent other than Rao, and then -8, exile the top 8 cards of your library. You may cast instant sorcery spells from among them without paying their mana costs. So if you get going, Rao could come in with like an 8 loyalty, flip over, and then you can just refill your hand. That is the only thing I'm thinking about with this card, is it's like a better Goblin Pyromancer in a deck that you probably don't want to play. Maybe we could talk to Bryant Cook about whether or not like Blue-Red Storm is a thing that they want to be doing.
Maybe this is like sees play in that slot in Modern. Like maybe you play some number of this, some number of Baral, and that's your stuff for Modern. But
I'd rather play this in Baral than Pyromancer. Electromancer.
Electromancer, yeah. The problem with instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast is that in Legacy you already have the most hyper-efficient versions of that, so you don't actually get the cost reduction. Like if you're playing the instant and sorcery combo deck, you're playing with Dark Ritual. Like you may play with the other things, but if you ever move into red, you're playing Rite of Flame. Yeah. And those things don't need the 1 mana cost. Right, maybe Pyretic Ritual, in which case you're making a concession.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You're doing something purposely worse than something else, either because you can't afford Lion's Eye Diamonds or because you just want to see if this works.
All that is to say, I don't think we need to spend much time on this card, because I just don't think I think it's another Diet Legacy card.
Yeah,
right.
I agree.
There's just the more powerful stuff in Legacy available to us. So
and
this
the
will never
body
get
isn't
over
doing
the hump.
anything for you as a 1/3.
The body's not doing anything, and it's like, okay, if you're in like Ruby Storm and you want to like do that, the thing is that like a lot of that shit is based off of artifacts. This only cares about instant and sorcery. So you could flip over 8 cards, flip over 2 lands, 3 artifacts, and then the rest are instant and sorceries. Like, did you even do anything?
Yeah. Well, all right. That is all of the red cards for Modern Horizons 3 that we think could see play. If you get a chance, like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't. I just checked. 78% of people watching our channel have not subscribed. Be part of the 22%. And then if you can support us on Patreon, we would surely love that. You can go to patreon.com/EternalDurdles. Thank you for watching, everybody. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the Legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/EternalDurdles. Thanks so much for watching.